The auctioneer's voice cut through the Nevada desert air like a blade, and Olive Dugan understood in that cold, terrible moment that she was no longer considered a person. It was the spring of 1873, and the sun over the mining camp of Rattlesnake Flats beat down without mercy on the cluster of canvas tents and rough-hewn timber structures that served as the settlement's permanent buildings. The camp had sprung up 18 months prior along a promising vein of silver ore running through the Sierra Nevada foothills, and in that brief time it had attracted every manner of man the American West could produce: the desperate, the dreaming, the dangerous, and the depraved. What it had not attracted, in any meaningful number, were women of virtue or of legal protection. The law, such as it was, existed only in the form of a self-appointed sheriff named Deke Harlan, a wide man with a tobacco-stained beard and small eyes that calculated the worth of everything he surveyed, including the young woman now standing on the flat bed of a supply wagon with her wrists bound in front of her with rough rope. Olive Dugan was 22 years old. She had arrived in Nevada Territory 3 weeks prior with her father, Thomas Dugan, who had borrowed money from men he should never have borrowed from in order to finance a mining claim he believed would make them wealthy. Thomas Dugan had been a dreamer his whole life, and Olive had loved that about him even when it made their lives difficult. They had traveled from Missouri together, just the two of them since her mother's passing 4 years before, and Olive had kept their spirits high with her cooking and her singing, and the small book of poetry she carried in her coat pocket wherever she went. Thomas Dugan had died of a fever 6 days after they arrived. He had gone quickly and without sufficient warning, and the debt he owed to Silas Croy, the man who ran Rattlesnake Flats with the easy authority of someone who had decided long ago that other people's suffering was simply the cost of doing business, had transferred, in Croy's reckoning, to Olive herself. Olive had tried to reason with Croy. She had tried to explain that she had nothing, that her father's claim was worthless without someone who knew mining, that she could work to repay what was owed through cooking or laundering or any honest labor available. Croy had listened to all of this with the expression of a man hearing something mildly amusing, and then he had told her there was a faster way to settle the debt, and that she didn't get a vote in the matter. So here she stood. The rope around her wrists was new enough that it still smelled of fresh hemp. Her brown hair had come loose from its pins and fell across one shoulder in a way she might have found romantic under any other circumstance. Her dress, a practical blue cotton with white collar, was dusty from the road, and her eyes, dark hazel, the color of creek water in autumn, were dry because she had decided somewhere between the tent where she'd been held and this wagon bed that she would not give these men her tears. They had taken enough. Perhaps 40 miners stood around the wagon, many of them fresh from the shafts with their faces still carrying the gray dust of the earth. Some looked uncomfortable. Most looked merely curious, in the way that men look at things they know are wrong but have decided are not quite wrong enough to require their intervention. Silas Croy stood beside the wagon with his thumbs in his vest pockets. He was a lean man in his 40s with a silver watch chain and the sort of thin smile that suggested he was always privately amused by the world. He nodded to the auctioneer, a rat-faced young man named Percy who had clearly been given his role because he would do it without complaint. "Fine young woman," Percy announced, his voice cracking slightly on the higher notes. "Capable, healthy, strong. Mr. Croy is offering the contract of service for 1 year in exchange for clearing a debt fairly owed. Bidding starts at 2 ounces of gold dust." The miners shuffled and murmured. A few made jokes to one another. Someone in the back called out a number. Then another man raised it. Olive stared at the distant line of pines on the ridge above the camp and reminded herself to keep breathing. She was almost certain she was going to be sick. It was at this precise moment, when the bidding had reached what Percy was breathlessly calling a remarkable 6 ounces, that a man came walking through the edge of the crowd, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided to take his time getting somewhere, and did not particularly care who noticed. Oliver Thatcher was 28 years old, though he looked older in the way that men do who have spent the better part of a decade working outdoors and thinking about difficult things. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore a canvas coat the color of dry grass, riding trousers, and boots that had seen considerable use. His hat was a wide-brimmed brown affair that had been knocked around enough to have character. He carried himself without any particular performance of toughness, which in the West, paradoxically, communicated more authority than the men who worked hard at it. Oliver Thatcher was not a miner. He was a cattle drover by trade, moving herds between ranches and railroad depots across Nevada and California, a solitary occupation that suited a man who preferred animals to most of the humans he encountered. He had stopped at Rattlesnake Flats only because his horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles back, and the camp was the nearest place to find a farrier. He had no stake in this community, no history here, and no particular reason to involve himself in its business. He heard the auction before he saw it. He registered what it was within a few seconds of pushing through the outer ring of the crowd and seeing the woman on the wagon. Oliver Thatcher had been raised by a woman, his mother, Clara, who had worked a cattle ranch alone after his father's death, and who had made very clear to her son that certain things were not open for debate. Chief among these was the fundamental dignity of a human being and the moral bankruptcy of those who would place it on sale. He stood very still for a moment, watching. He saw the rope around her wrists. He saw the set of her jaw stubborn, white with the effort of control. He saw her look deliberately away from the crowd toward the tree line, and something about that small act of private defiance moved through him like a current. He looked at Silas Croy. He had encountered men like Croy before and could read them like a trail map. He turned and looked at the crowd, estimating the mood, the numbers, the men who might object to what he was thinking of doing, and whether they were the kind of men who would do more than object. Then Oliver Thatcher pushed his way to the front of the crowd, reached into the inner pocket of his canvas coat and withdrew a leather pouch. "Stop," he said. His voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that traveled. Percy the auctioneer stopped with his mouth open. Croy turned to look at Oliver with the calm assessment of a man who wanted to know what kind of trouble this might be. "I will buy the contract," Oliver said. "Whatever the highest bid is, I will double it." A ripple went through the crowd. Percy looked at Croy. Croy looked at Oliver for a long moment, and whatever he saw there made him decide that this was straightforward commerce and not a complication. "Current bid is 7 ounces, Percy said. 14, Oliver said, and he set the leather pouch on the side rail of the wagon with a sound that carried. Croy stepped forward, took the pouch, and weighed it in his palm in the experienced way of a man who had handled enough gold dust to calibrate his grip precisely. He nodded. "Sale concluded," Percy said, and he looked relieved. The crowd began to break apart, men drifting back to their work and their conversations, and whatever had occupied them before this uncomfortable theater. Oliver stepped up onto the wheel of the wagon and over its side and stood in front of Olive Dugan with the rope still on her wrists and their faces perhaps 2 feet apart. This close, he could see that her eyes were not quite as dry as she had wanted them to be. There was a brightness there that had nothing to do with the noon sun. "I am going to untie you," he said, "and then I am going to give you something." "You just bought my labor," she said. Her voice was steady, though it cost her. "Don't expect gratitude for it." "I don't want your labor," he said. He took out a pocket knife and cut the rope from her wrists in 2 quick strokes, and she brought her hands up to rub the red marks where it had bit in. He watched her do this, and then he reached back and picked up the leather pouch that Croy had set down when he stepped away to speak to Percy about some piece of paperwork. Wait, no. He had come prepared. He pulled from his other inside coat pocket a second leather pouch, nearly identical to the first, and he held it out to Olive. "This is yours," he said. She stared at it. "What?" "Gold dust. Roughly 14 ounces, same as what I paid, maybe a little more." He kept his hand extended, steady, patient. There's enough here to get you to Sacramento, maybe to San Francisco if you're careful. There are people who help in Sacramento, women who run boarding houses that are safe. A minister's wife named Hazel Drummond, who I've heard takes in women who need a new start. He paused. Take it, and then run. Olive looked at the pouch. She looked at his face. She was trying to read something in it, some angle she hadn't found yet, because in her experience nothing was ever what it appeared to be in the moment of its offering. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, "and because no one else was doing it." "That's a 14-ounce reason for why you shouldn't," she said. "That's more than most men earn in a month of hard labor." "I've had a good run of seasons," he said, which was true. "Take it." She took the pouch. Her fingers closed around it, and for just a moment something crossed her face, not quite relief, not quite grief, something between the two that belongs to people who have held themselves together for so long that the first small kindness threatens to undo them entirely. "There's a livery at the south end of camp," he said. "A man named Hewitt runs it. He's decent. Tell him Oliver Thatcher sent you, and that you need a horse headed toward Carson City before the afternoon stage leaves. He'll set you right." "And what about you?" she asked. "I've got a horse to see to," he said, "and then a herd to move up toward Reno by Thursday." She searched his face one more moment, then looked past him at the thinning crowd, and at the wagon bed beneath her feet, and at the distant tree line she had been staring at while strangers placed numbers on her life. "I don't even know your name," she said. "Oliver Thatcher," he said. "Olive Dugan," she said, and then a small, disbelieving sound escaped her that might have been almost a laugh. "We're both Olivers." Something shifted in his expression then, a warmth moving through the seriousness of it, and for just a moment he looked younger and considerably less like a man who had been alone with his own thoughts for too long. "So we are," he said. She climbed down from the wagon. She walked south without looking back, and Oliver Thatcher watched her go until the dust of the camp swallowed her up, and then he turned and went to find the farrier. He told himself, walking away, that he felt satisfied. That the satisfaction of a right action was its own complete reward. That he was a man who moved cattle between one place and another, and that was sufficient occupation for a life. He found the satisfaction to be genuine and also insufficient, though he could not have explained precisely what it was lacking, and so he filed it away in the manner of a practical man dealing with an impractical feeling, and went about his business. Rattlesnake Flats had one farrier, a broad-chested German immigrant named Wilhelm Bauer, who worked with magnificent efficiency and charged accordingly. While Wilhelm worked on his horse, a dark bay gelding Oliver called Dutch, for reasons that had evolved over 4 years of travel and were now too complicated to trace back to their origin. Oliver sat on an overturned bucket in the shade of the livery wall and ate a strip of dried beef, and thought about the woman with the hazel eyes and the stubborn jaw, and the voice that had stayed steady when steadiness must have felt like climbing a mountain. He thought about her saying they were both Olivers, and the way the disbelieving sound had come out of her, and how much courage it took to find something even faintly amusing at the bottom of the worst hour of your life. He thought about these things with the focused attention of a man who is not quite willing to admit what he is actually doing. Hewitt, who ran the livery, was a wiry older man with kind eyes who confirmed, when Oliver asked with studied casualness, that a young woman matching Olive's description had come in about a half-hour ago, and that he had arranged for her to ride with a freighter heading to Carson City that afternoon, a reliable man named Corbett who made the run twice a week and was entirely trustworthy. "She seemed steady," Hewitt said, with the approval of a man who had seen every sort come through his livery. "Shook my hand like she meant it. Asked me what time Corbett would leave and then sat herself down on that bench over there to wait. Didn't complain, didn't carry on, just sat." "Good," Oliver said. "She one of yours?" Hewitt asked with the innocent inquiry of a man who meant it literally, wondering if she was a hired hand or a relative. "No," Oliver said. "She's nobody's." He said it with a conviction that was only slightly undercut by the fact that he then asked what direction the Carson City road ran from the south end of camp, and whether a rider moving at a decent pace might catch a freight wagon that had left within the last few hours. Hewitt regarded him for a moment with the considering expression of a man who had learned to recognize when people were lying to themselves. "Road runs due west past the mill," Hewitt said. "Corbett doesn't push his team hard. He's generally making 8 miles an hour on the flats." Oliver retrieved Dutch, who was newly shod and considerably less irritable than he had been that morning, paid Wilhelm a fair wage plus a reasonable extra for the speed of the work, and rode west. He told himself he only wanted to be certain she had gotten clear of the camp without incident. He caught the freight wagon about 4 miles out, a heavy-bodied Studebaker hauler with canvas over its load bed, and a solid gray team pulling it at exactly the pace Hewitt had described. Oliver came up alongside at an easy canter, and Corbett, a heavy-set man in a red flannel shirt with a gray beard, nodded at him without concern. Beside Corbett on the bench sat Olive Dugan, who turned at the sound of hoofbeats with her hand, reflexively going toward her coat pocket before she registered who it was. Then she simply looked at him. He pulled Dutch to a walk matching the wagon's pace. "Just wanted to be certain you got clear," he said. "I'm clear," she said. "Good." A beat of silence. Dutch snorted softly. A raven called from somewhere up on the ridge. "Then why are you still riding beside the wagon?" she asked. He had no satisfactory answer for this, so he said, "Carson City is a decent town. You'll be safe there." "I know," she said. "Corbett has been very kind." Corbett, who was clearly following this exchange with peripheral interest while maintaining the professional dignity of a man focused on his driving, said nothing. "Sacramento would be better," Oliver said. "Long term." "You mentioned that," Olive said, "the minister's wife. Hazel Drummond, on 5th Street near the Methodist Church. You seem to know a great deal about resources for women in difficult circumstances," she said, and there was something in her tone that was not quite accusation and not quite curiosity, something delicately balanced between the two. "My mother had difficult circumstances," he said, "after my father died. She always said she wished there had been more people in the world willing to say here is where you go and here is who will help you." Olive looked at him for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming in low from the west, and it caught the dust on his coat and the angles of his face. And she thought again, as she had on the wagon, that she could not find the angle in this. Could not locate the place where his kindness turned into something she would have to pay for. "Where are you headed after Reno?" she asked. "South. I've got a contract moving a herd down from a ranch in Winnemucca to a buyer in Elko. Should take about 3 weeks. And after that I'll see what's next," he said, with the easy equanimity of a man whose life had been arranged around its own open ends for long enough that it no longer troubled him. "That sounds lonely," she said. He looked at her. "It can be," he said, after a moment, in a way that suggested honesty had arrived somewhat ahead of his intention to offer it. The wagon rolled on. Oliver rode beside it for another 2 miles without any particular justification, and with only the occasional exchange of words between them, comments on the landscape, on the quality of the road, on a hawk that described a wide circle above the valley to their north. These small observations passed back and forth with the naturalness of people who have known each other considerably longer than they have, and both of them felt it without quite knowing what to do with the feeling. When they reached the junction where the road forked, one branch continuing west toward Carson City and another curling north toward Reno, Oliver pulled Dutch to a stop. "This is where I go north," he said. The wagon stopped too. Corbett studied his team with great interest. Olive looked at Oliver for a moment that was several seconds longer than a simple farewell required. "Thank you," she said, and the 2 words carried the weight of everything that had happened that day, and everything she had held together through it, and the strange fact that a stranger on horseback had reached into her worst moment and pulled her out of it for no reason she could logically identify. "Truly." "You would have found a way out on your own," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but this was faster." He almost smiled. "Take care of yourself, Olive Dugan." "Ride safe, Oliver Thatcher," she said. He turned Dutch north and did not look back, and Corbett clicked at his team and the wagon rolled west, and the junction sat empty in the long evening light. Oliver Thatcher rode north for about a mile and a half before he stopped on a flat piece of ground overlooking the valley and sat on his horse for a few minutes in the manner of a man taking in the scenery. Below him, the Carson City Road was still visible as a pale line running west through the sage, and the Studebaker wagon was a small dark shape moving along it, getting smaller. He watched it until it disappeared behind a stand of cottonwoods. Then he rode on to Reno, where the next morning he found a telegram waiting for him at the Western Union office from the ranch in Winnemucca, saying the herd had been delayed by a flooding creek, and would he be available in 3 weeks rather than 1. He wired back that he would. He then spent several minutes standing outside the telegraph office in the bright Reno morning with his hands in his coat pockets, conducting an internal argument with himself that he would have found embarrassing if anyone had been able to read his thoughts. He was a practical man. He was employed and responsible and had obligations that ran on schedules. He was not the kind of man who chased strangers. He was also, it emerged clearly on one side of this argument, a man who had 3 weeks of unexpected time and a very specific unresolved feeling that seemed to have taken up permanent residence somewhere in the region of his chest. He went to the nearest hotel, which was a respectable establishment called the Riverside, and he got a room and a bath and a decent meal, and he told himself he would start for Sacramento in the morning simply because he had never seen the city, and it was a reasonable thing to do with time on his hands. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. The ride from Reno to Sacramento took 3 days through the Sierra Nevada, a journey of considerable beauty and some hardship, as the passes still held patches of snow in the mid-spring cold. Oliver moved through the mountains with the methodical patience of a man accustomed to long travel, camping each night, and making good time on the clearer stretches. Dutch, who was a sensible horse with excellent endurance, seemed to take the altitude without complaint. Sacramento in 1873 was a city in full growth, humming with commerce and ambition, and the complicated energy of a place that had decided it was going to matter. The river ran wide and brown at its edge, the streets were a mixture of mud and plank boardwalks, and the buildings ranged from imposing brick mercantiles to hastily assembled timber structures that leaned slightly in ways that suggested they were still deciding whether to stay upright. It smelled of horses and river water and bread from the bakeries that seemed to occupy every third corner. Oliver found the Methodist church on 5th Street without difficulty. He then stood across the road from it for a full 5 minutes being honest with himself about what he was doing, and the honest answer was that he was looking for a woman he had known for approximately 3 hours and had no claim on and no particular right to seek out, and that the looking had nothing to do with responsible concern for her welfare, and everything to do with the fact that in 14 years of a life that had been largely lived in the company of cattle and open sky, he had never met a woman who found something to almost laugh at in the worst moment of her life, and he did not know what to do with wanting to know what she laughed at when things were going well. He crossed the street and knocked on the door of the house beside the church, which had a small painted sign reading Drummond beside it. A woman of about 50 with a capable face and sharp dark eyes opened the door. This was clearly Hazel Drummond, and she looked at Oliver with the direct assessment of a woman who had spent considerable time evaluating strangers at her doorstep. "Mrs. Drummond," he said, "my name is Oliver Thatcher. I'm looking for a young woman named Olive Dugan. I believe she may have come here." Hazel Drummond studied him for a moment longer. "And what is your interest in Miss Dugan?" "I met her in Nevada," he said. "I wanted to be certain she arrived safely." "She arrived safely," Hazel said. Then, after another considering pause, "You're the man who gave her the gold dust." "Yes, ma'am." Hazel Drummond opened the door a little wider. "She mentioned you," she said, in a tone of voice that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who has decided to be neutral about something. "She mentioned you several times." Oliver held very still. "Did she?" She's at the market, Hazel said. Went this morning with my niece to help with the shopping. She's been here 4 days and she has already organized my pantry, repaired a fence post in the back garden, and taught my niece 3 songs on the piano. Hazel paused. She's a capable young woman. Yes, Oliver said. She is. You can wait in the garden if you like, Hazel said, and she stepped back from the door. Oliver waited in the garden, which was a pleasant small space behind the house with raised beds of early spring vegetables and a bench against the south-facing wall. He sat on the bench and held his hat in his hands and looked at the bean seedlings coming up in the nearest bed and tried to think of what he was going to say. He had not arrived at anything particularly eloquent when he heard the back gate open and Olive Dugan's voice saying something to the person she was with. And then the gate swung open, and she came through it carrying a basket of goods from the market, and she saw him. She stopped. He stood up. They looked at each other across the small garden with the bean seedlings between them and the Sacramento afternoon light coming warm and gold over the back wall. You came to Sacramento, she said. I had time, he said. You said you had a herd to move. It was delayed. By how much? 3 weeks. She set the basket down on the garden path. The young woman who had come in behind her, Hazel's niece, a girl of about 17 named Clara who had the good sense to read a room immediately, quietly took the basket through the back door and left them alone. Oliver Thatcher, Olive said, in the tone of someone working out a complicated sum. You rode 3 days through the Sierra Nevada. The scenery is very good, he said. The scenery, she repeated. And I wanted to know that you were all right, he said. And this time he said it without the deflection, straight and simple, the way he said most things when he stopped trying to arrange them first. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something different about her here in this garden. 4 days of safety had done what the stubbornness and the dry eyes on that wagon could not quite accomplish. She looked like herself, whoever that was. She had color in her face, and she stood without that quality of compressed tension that had defined every line of her in Rattlesnake Flats. Her hair was pinned up properly. She was wearing a different dress, a light brown one, probably borrowed from Hazel or purchased with some of the gold dust. She looked, Oliver thought, as though she had arrived somewhere and intended to stay. I am all right, she said. More than all right. Hazel is very kind. I've been helping her with the household while I figure out what comes next. She paused. I'm thinking about writing to a cousin in Portland. I haven't seen her in years, but we were close as children. I think she might. She stopped. She was watching his face. You're not happy about Portland, she said with the accuracy of a woman who paid close attention. It's a fine city, he said. That's not what your face says. He turned his hat in his hands. My face says whatever it says. Portland is a fine city and your cousin sounds like a sensible plan. But, she said, he looked at her directly. But I rode 3 days through the Sierra Nevada, he said, and I don't think it was entirely about the scenery. The silence that followed was the kind that has a shape, that occupies space in the air between 2 people, not uncomfortable so much as weighted with things that haven't been said yet but are waiting just at the near edge of words. You don't know me, Olive said. Not really. I know what I saw, he said, on that wagon and in the road after. And I know that in 3 hours of knowing you, I found myself thinking about you for 3 days on horseback, which is not a thing that has happened to me with any regularity. She took a breath. What are you saying, Oliver Thatcher? I am saying, he said carefully, as though he were feeling the path ahead of him with his boot before he trusted it with his weight, that if you would be willing, I would like to know you better. If you'd let me spend some of these 3 weeks in Sacramento, not underfoot, not making a nuisance of myself, but close enough to talk, and to find out what you laugh at when things are going well. She blinked. What? On the wagon, he said. When you realized we were both Olivers, that sound you made. I want to know what you sound like when nothing is terrible. She stared at him. Then she laughed. Not the disbelieving sound from before, but a full, real laugh that started somewhere in her chest and came out warm and a little surprised at itself. And it was the best thing Oliver Thatcher had heard in a very long time, perhaps in years, perhaps ever. I sound like that, she said when she had recovered. Yes, he said. You do. She looked at him in the garden light and he looked back, and the bean seedlings grew quietly between them. "You can stay in Sacramento," she said. "There are 2 hotels within a reasonable distance. Mrs. Drummond will have an opinion about which one is more respectable." "I'll ask her," he said. "Good." She picked up her basket from where Clara had set it down, realized it was empty, set it down again, and then laughed at herself for that too, and Oliver thought that laugh was going to create a significant problem for his capacity to think about anything else. The 3 weeks that followed were among the most singular of Oliver Thatcher's life. He stayed at the Belmont Hotel on K Street, which Hazel Drummond had confirmed was the more respectable of the 2 options, and he kept himself constructively occupied with the business of not being underfoot. He visited a stockyard he had a professional acquaintance with. He repaired some equipment. He wrote several letters regarding the Winnemucca herd. None of this occupied him as fully as he would have liked, because the portion of his attention not engaged with practical tasks was consistently elsewhere. He called on Olive at the Drummond house each morning, nominally to inquire whether there was anything he could do to be useful. Hazel Drummond, who was nobody's fool and had developed a considerable opinion of Oliver Thatcher in the first 5 minutes of meeting him, generally found something for him to do: a window frame that needed resealing, a section of fence that needed reinforcing, various tasks that a capable man with time on his hands could address. Oliver addressed them with genuine willingness and without any performance, which Hazel noted approvingly to Olive on several occasions. After the morning's work, Oliver and Olive would walk. Sacramento offered considerable walking territory. Along the river, through the growing residential streets, past the markets and the parks, and the edges of the city where the orchards were coming into blossom. They talked the way people do when they are discovering each other, and finding, with some surprise, that the territory is larger and more interesting than they had expected. She told him about Missouri and about her father, about Thomas Dugan's optimism, which had been both his greatest quality and the reason they had ended up in Nevada in the first place. She talked about her mother, who had been a school teacher, and had given Olive her love of books and her habit of carrying poetry in her pocket. She pulled the book of poetry out and showed him a small, battered volume of verse, Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and several poets he didn't know, the pages worn soft with handling. "She gave me this the winter before she died," Olive said. "I've read every poem so many times I could recite them from memory, but I still like seeing the pages." Oliver asked her to read one, and she did, there on a bench beside the river, and her voice reading poetry was different from her speaking voice, lower and more considered, and he listened to it the way he listened to things that mattered. He told her about growing up on the ranch in eastern California with his mother and 2 older sisters, about his father who had died of a riding accident when Oliver was 12, about learning cattle work from a neighbor who had taken pity on a fatherless boy and eventually taken him on as a proper hand. He told her about the years of driving herds, about the particular solitude of the trail that he had genuinely loved and also, increasingly, felt the weight of. He told her about Dutch, who had been his only consistent company for 4 years, and who had opinions about this arrangement that Oliver considered reasonable. "Do you think about settling somewhere?" she asked once, on one of their river walks, in the easy way of someone asking a question they had been thinking about for a while. "More lately," he said. "I've been putting money aside. There's land in the Central Valley I've had my eye on. Small parcel, good water access, decent grazing. I could run a modest operation." He paused. "It's the kind of thing that makes more sense with—" He stopped himself. "With what?" she asked, looking at him sideways. "With time," he said, which was true but incomplete, and she didn't press him, but she did look at the river in a way that suggested she had heard the incomplete part clearly. On the 8th day it rained. A solid Sacramento rain that came in from the bay and settled over the city with serious intent, and Oliver came to the Drummond house in the morning to find that none of the outdoor work was possible, and that Hazel had gone to sit with a sick neighbor for the day. Clara was in the parlor practicing piano scales with steadfast commitment. Oliver and Olive sat in the kitchen with cups of coffee and a morning that had opened up unexpectedly around them, and they talked for 4 hours without noticing the time pass. They talked about things that were harder to say than scenery or family history, about fear, about loneliness, about what it was like to arrive in a place where no one knew your name and have to build yourself from nothing. Olive talked about those days in the mining camp after her father died, before Croy had approached her, when she had been sitting in a canvas tent with no money and no options, and had been trying to think practically about survival while her grief pressed on her from the inside. "I kept thinking about what my mother would say," she said. "She always said that the next right thing is usually visible if you stand still long enough to see it. I was trying very hard to stand still." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "And then Croy came with his proposition, and I realized that standing still had used up all its available time." Oliver said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad I stopped for a shoe." She looked at him. "Dutch throwing that shoe," he said. 3 miles from Rattlesnake Flats. If he had thrown it an hour earlier or later, I'd have found a different farrier. I wouldn't have been there." He paused. "I don't know what I believe about Providence, but I'm glad for the shoe." Something shifted in her face when he said that, some last piece of held-back wariness moving aside. "I'm glad, too," she said quietly. The rain continued outside. Clara's piano scales gave way to a recognizable melody. Oliver reached across the table and, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was very aware of what he was doing and had decided to do it anyway, covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that for a while in the kitchen with the rain on the windows, not needing to say anything else right then. After that, things were different in the clear and definite way that things are different once you have stopped pretending they might be something other than what they are. They were not careless about it. Neither of them were careless people by nature, and the circumstances of how they had met created a particular seriousness in both of them about not treating what was growing between them lightly. But they also stopped pretending. Oliver stopped presenting his daily calls as being about fence repairs. Olive stopped framing her questions about his future plans as idle curiosity. Hazel Drummond watched all of this with visible satisfaction and the occasional well-aimed comment that kept things honest. "He's a good man," Hazel told Olive one evening while they were washing the supper dishes and Oliver had gone back to his hotel. "I've met a great many men in my life, and I know the difference between a good one and a persuasive one. He's the real variety." "I know," Olive said. "And you feel the same about him as he feels about you, which I can see plainly if not loudly." Olive was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with more focus than it required. "I came here with a bag of gold dust and nothing else," she said. "I was sold." She stopped. "Like property," Hazel said without flinching from it. "Yes." Olive set the plate down. "And I've been telling myself that I need to get my feet properly under me before I can think about any of this. That I need to write to Portland or find work or establish something that is mine before I can." She trailed off. "Before you can trust that someone wants you and not the idea of you," Hazel said, with the precision of a woman who had heard many women's private thoughts. "Yes," Olive said. "That's sensible," Hazel said. "But there's a difference between sensible waiting and hiding from something good because you've been through something bad." Olive looked at the soapy water in the basin. "How do you know which is which?" "Usually," Hazel said, "the hiding one feels safer." On the 15th day, Oliver arrived in the morning to find Olive already outside in the small garden, sitting on the bench with her book of poetry open on her knee but not reading it. She was watching a pair of sparrows argue over something in the bean bed, and she looked, Oliver thought, like someone who had made a decision. He sat down beside her on the bench. She closed the poetry book and put it in her coat pocket. "I've been thinking," she said. "So have I," he said. "You first," she said. He turned to look at her directly. "I have approximately a week and a half left before I need to start north for Winnemucca," he said. And I have been trying to think of a way to say what I want to say that is honest without being presumptuous, because we have known each other for 2 weeks and that is not a long time." "It isn't," she agreed. "But it has also been, in my experience, the most significant 2 weeks I can account for," he said. "And I know what I know about people, and what I know about you is that you are remarkable, Olive. Not because of what you survived, though you did, and remarkably, but because of what you are when nothing is terrible, which you asked me about and I still think is more important." She was looking at him steadily. "I'm not going to ask you to make any decisions in a week and a half that you don't want to make," he said. "I won't push, but I want you to know that the land in the Central Valley, it's real. It's a place I intend to actually make something of. And when I picture it, when I try to picture what making something of it actually looks like, you are in the picture, Olive. You've been in it since the garden with the bean seedlings, and I've stopped pretending otherwise." She let out a slow breath. "I wrote to my cousin in Portland," she said. "Eleanor," she wrote back. "She has a spare room and a good position for me working at her husband's printing shop." She paused. "It's a good situation." "It sounds like it," Oliver said. "I was going to go," she said. "I had it nearly settled in my mind. And now," she said, "I am sitting in a garden in Sacramento with the man who handed me a bag of gold dust and told me to run, and I am thinking that the next right thing might be different from the sensible thing, and that my mother might have been willing to make that distinction under the right circumstances." Oliver Thatcher looked at her. The morning light was coming over the garden wall and everything was very clear and still. "What are you saying, Olive Dugan?" he asked. "I'm saying," she said slowly, finding the words the same way he had in this same garden 2 weeks ago, feeling for solid ground, "that I would like to see the land in the Central Valley. I would like to know if the water access is as good as you say, and whether the soil is the kind that would take a kitchen garden. I would like," her voice steadied, "I would like to know what it is that you're building, Oliver, because I think I might want to help build it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The water access is excellent. There's a creek that runs along the eastern edge of the parcel, spring-fed, runs clear almost all year. And the soil, deep, good for roots." She nodded slowly as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "I think," she said, "that if you were to ask me a question, a particular kind of question, I might have a particular kind of answer." Oliver Thatcher reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small object. It was a ring, a modest thing, a thin band of gold with a small dark stone that caught the light. She blinked at it. "I bought it this morning," he said, "at the jeweler on J Street. I went early because I wasn't sure I was going to have the nerve by the afternoon." He held it in the palm of his hand between them, not offering it yet, just showing her that it was real, that he was serious, that this was not an impulsive gesture but a considered one. "I know 2 weeks is not long." 2 weeks and 3 hours, she said. 2 weeks and 3 hours, he agreed. "And I know that you have been through something that gives you every right to take as much time as you need to trust anything again. I will wait as long as you need. But I would like you to know that I intend to ask, and that the question is, Olive Dugan, I would like very much for you to be my wife, if you would be willing." She looked at the ring in his palm. She looked at his face. She thought about her mother saying the next right thing is usually visible if you stand still long enough. She thought about the wagon bed and the rope and the hazel-colored creek water she had imagined during the auction when she was looking for something to fix her mind on. She thought about a man's hand reaching across a kitchen table in the rain. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He slid the ring onto her finger and her hand closed around his, and they sat in Hazel Drummond's garden in the Sacramento morning, and were still for a moment in the good way, the way of two people who have arrived somewhere and both know it. When Hazel came home from her sick neighbor's house that afternoon, she found them in the kitchen making supper together, moving around each other in the small space with the natural accommodation of people who are already learning the shape of each other's presence, and Olive showed her the ring, and Hazel Drummond, who was not a woman given to excessive displays of feeling, hugged Olive firmly and then shook Oliver's hand with both of hers. "Don't make her a stranger," she said to Oliver. "I won't," he said. "I expect we'll come back through Sacramento regularly. It's on the way." "On the way to where?" "Everywhere we're going," he said. They were married 11 days later at the Methodist Church on 5th Street. Reverend Drummond, Hazel's husband, performed the ceremony, and Hazel and Clara stood as witnesses, and Dutch was tied to the hitching post outside and snorted once during the vows in a way that Clara maintained for years afterward was clearly a comment of approval. Olive wore a dress that she and Hazel had altered from one of Hazel's spares, a soft ivory with small buttons at the cuffs and a collar that suited her. Oliver wore a clean shirt and his good canvas coat, which was as dressed up as he had been since his eldest sister's wedding 6 years prior, and he thought, standing at the altar watching Olive come down the small aisle with Hazel's arm through hers, that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. She stood beside him and they said the words to each other, and when he lifted her hand to put the ring back on her finger properly this time, she was looking at him with those hazel eyes entirely clear and entirely present. Not a trace of the distance she had needed to survive on the wagon, wholly here, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever stood next to. "I do," she said, and her voice was steady with the good kind of certainty. They spent their wedding night at the Belmont Hotel, which Hazel had arranged to be their gift, and then the following morning they packed Dutch, who was going to have to share a saddle for the foreseeable future, a situation he expressed feelings about, and headed north. Oliver had sent a telegram to Winnemucca explaining that he would be arriving with his wife. A piece of news he expected would cause exactly the amount of confusion and raised eyebrows in the cattle community that it caused. He was not wrong. The rancher who had hired him, a solid Scotsman named Grant Macpherson, shook Oliver's hand on arrival and then shook Olive's hand with the expression of a man updating his understanding of Oliver Thatcher considerably. "Didn't know you were the marrying type," Macpherson said. "Neither did I," Oliver said. Olive laughed and Macpherson looked from one to the other of them with the dawning expression of a man who was beginning to understand that something interesting had happened, and that he was not going to receive the full account of it. The Winnemucca cattle drive took 4 weeks rather than 3 because the spring flooding had done genuine damage to the lower range roads and required longer routes. Oliver was out on the range most days with the other drovers, and Olive stayed at the Macpherson Ranch, where Mrs. Macpherson, a solidly competent woman named Agnes, had taken one look at Olive and correctly identified someone useful. Olive helped Agnes with the household, with the garden, with the preserving and the cooking and the management of the 3 children Macpherson children under 10, who were in permanent active motion. She also helped Agnes with the accounts, since it turned out that Thomas Dugan, for all his impracticality, had made sure his daughter could do arithmetic, and Agnes Macpherson's books had a running problem in the 3rd column that no one in the household could locate. Olive found it in an afternoon. Agnes Macpherson became one of the great friendships of Olive's life. When the drive finished, and Oliver came back to the ranch with a week's worth of trail dust, and the settled look of a man who had done work he knew how to do well, Olive was sitting on the Macpherson porch with Agnes drinking coffee, and they were deep in a conversation about the practical requirements of running a small cattle operation that Oliver found himself stopping to listen to from the gate, because it was precise and knowledgeable and completely absorbing. "You've been talking to Agnes about the business," he said later. "She knows a great deal," Olive said. "She's been running the operational side of this ranch for 11 years while Grant does the driving and the buying. Most of what he knows about the accounting came from her." "I know," Oliver said. "Grant told me once when he thought I wasn't taking it in." "Do you have it?" she asked. "The money for the Central Valley land," he nodded. "Enough for the deposit and the first year's setup costs. It'll be tight at first." "I still have the gold dust," she said. "What I haven't spent, about 8 ounces left." He started to say something. "It was given freely," she said. "Don't be stubborn about it. It's ours now." He looked at her for a moment. "Ours," he said, and the word sat differently in his mouth than it had for any of the years before. "Ours," she confirmed. They rode south from Winnemucca in early summer, taking the long road down through Nevada and into California. Oliver had the deed documents for the land in the Central Valley in his saddlebag. He had arranged the purchase through a land agent in Reno before the drive, and the parcel was registered in both their names, which the land agent had looked twice at before writing it down, since the arrangement was less common than it ought to have been but not unheard of. The land was in the San Joaquin Valley, east of Stockton, a parcel of about 80 acres with the spring-fed creek along the eastern edge, exactly as Oliver had described, in soil that Olive dug her hand into on arrival and confirmed was indeed the kind that would take a kitchen garden. It was also, when they arrived, entirely undeveloped. A previous owner had put up a rough structure that could charitably be called a beginning of a cabin, more accurately a collection of timber and ambition without a roof or a proper floor. Olive stood beside Dutch looking at it in the long June afternoon light. "Well," she said. "I know," Oliver said. "No, I was going to say," she paused, looking at it. "It has good bones." "It has some bones," he said. She laughed. "We are going to need lumber," she said, "and someone who knows how to set a proper floor." "I know how to set a floor." She turned to look at him. "You know how to set a floor?" "My mother made me learn," he said. "She said a man who couldn't repair his own home was a liability." He paused. "She was generally right about things." "I would like very much to meet your mother," Olive said. "She's in Eastern California," he said. "We could go before the summer is out." He looked at the structure. "After we have a roof." They spent that summer building. It was one of the defining experiences of Olive Dugan Thatcher's life, and she thought about it in great detail for decades afterward. The particular quality of those months when everything was new and hard and specific, when every day produced something you could point to as an accomplishment, when the smell of fresh lumber and turned earth became the smell of her own life taking shape. Oliver knew more about construction than she had expected, and she learned quickly from watching and asking and doing. And they had help from a neighboring family named Caldwell who had settled the parcel to the west 2 years prior, and who arrived the second week with their 2 adult sons, and a covered wagon full of tools, and a very straightforward offer of labor in exchange for help with the Caldwell's own roof, which had wintered badly and needed attention. The Caldwells were a generous people. Nora Caldwell, about 50 with strong hands and a remarkable laugh, told Olive the history of the valley over the course of several shared dinners, who owned what and who was honest and who was not, where the nearest doctor was and what he was competent to treat, and what required the journey to Stockton. She talked about the Miwok people whose land this valley had been, and whose presence and absence both left marks on the landscape that Nora pointed out with a directness that Olive appreciated: the names of creeks and hills, the uses of certain plants along the water, the knowledge that the land under their feet had a history longer and more complicated than any deed could account for. Olive listened carefully to all of this. By August they had a proper cabin, 4 rooms, a real floor, a stone fireplace that drew well, a porch facing west to catch the evening cool. They had broken ground on the kitchen garden, and Olive had planted what she could still get in before fall, the root vegetables and hardy greens that would carry them into winter. Oliver had purchased a small beginning herd, 8 cattle and 4 horses, including Dutch, who now had company he viewed with dignified tolerance, and had begun working the range routines that would define his days. They went to Eastern California in September. Oliver's mother, Clara Thatcher, was a woman in her early 60s with white hair and her son's dark eyes, and a quality of absolute directness that Olive found immediately comfortable. She lived in a modest house on the ranch property where Oliver had grown up, managed by Oliver's eldest sister Josephine and her husband, with Clara occupying a settled position of authority and opinion. Clara Thatcher hugged her son for a long time when they arrived and said nothing particular about it, which Olive thought was eloquent. When Oliver introduced Olive, Clara took both of Olive's hands in hers and looked at her carefully, not unkindly, with the serious attention of someone doing an important assessment. "He told me in a letter," Clara said. "He told me most of it." "All of it?" Olive asked. "I imagine he left parts out," Clara said. "He usually does, but enough." She still held Olive's hands. "I want you to know," she said, "that what happened to you was wrong, plainly and fully wrong. And that you are here now, and that matters more than what brought you here." Olive felt the back of her eyes sting in the way they had on the wagon, the kindness undoing something held carefully tight. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Come in and tell me about this land you've started. Oliver says there's a spring-fed creek." "Along the eastern edge," Olive said. "Runs clear nearly all year." Clara looked at her son over Olive's shoulder with an expression that Oliver would have needed all his years of knowing her to fully interpret, and that Josephine, who saw it from the doorway, understood as, "Well done, finally. I was beginning to wonder." They stayed a week. Oliver helped with the fall cattle work on the family ranch, and Olive talked to Clara every evening at length about the Central Valley land. And Clara told her what she knew about cattle operations, which was a great deal acquired over decades of first-hand experience, and gave her practical advice about kitchen gardens in similar soil and the particular politics of neighboring ranchers that could make or break a new operation, depending on how the early relationships were managed. On the last evening, sitting on Clara's porch, Oliver said to his mother, "What do you think of her?" Clara looked at him with the slightly exasperated patience of a woman who had been answering this person's question since he was learning to walk. "I think," she said, "that she is the most sensible choice you have ever made, and that given some of your previous choices, that is saying something substantial. I think she will make you better than you already are, which is not an easy thing to make someone since you started fairly high." She paused. "I also think you knew all of this before you asked me." "I wanted to hear you say it," he said. "I know you did," she said. "That hasn't changed since you were 6. Olive, who had heard this exchange from inside through the open window, while she was helping Josephine with the last of the dishes, pressed her lips together to keep the laugh quiet. They rode back to the San Joaquin Valley in the first days of October, with the autumn coming in gold and cool across the Sierra foothills, and everything that greeted them on their return. The cabin, the garden put to bed for winter, the cattle in the south pasture, Dutch standing at the fence with his usual air of mild grievance, was theirs, made by their hands, registered in their names, and exactly what it appeared to be. Their first winter on the property was hard in the specific way of first winters in new places, when you are learning all the things you didn't know you didn't know. The creek flooded its banks in January during a heavy rain week, and came close to the eastern fence line. Oliver rebuilt the fence line further back in February when the ground dried, and they talked for 2 evenings about whether to reinforce the creek bank or simply plan the operation's eastern boundary accordingly. They settled on the latter, practical and permanent. Nora Caldwell's husband Robert fell ill in February, a serious lung infection that kept him in bed for 6 weeks, and Olive spent a considerable amount of time at the Caldwell house, helping Nora manage the household and the nursing while Oliver did what he could with the Caldwell range work alongside the Caldwell sons. Robert recovered slowly and then fully, and was embarrassingly grateful. And from that point forward, the Caldwell-Thatcher relationship was the kind of neighborly friendship that both families referred to as simply the way things were done. In the spring, Olive planted the kitchen garden in proper earnest: tomatoes, squash, beans, root vegetables, herbs along the south wall of the cabin, where the sun held longest. She also planted 4 apple trees along the creek fence line, a long-term investment she acknowledged wouldn't produce meaningfully for years, and planted anyway because she intended to be here for years. Oliver watched her put the apple trees in the ground, and thought about the fact that she had come to him with nothing but a bag of gold dust, and the clothes she wore, and a book of poetry in her pocket. And look at what she was doing with the ground. He thought this with the particular quality of feeling that he had begun to understand was simply what love looked like in practice, not the dramatic varieties, though those had had their moment at the beginning, but the everyday recognition of what you have standing beside you. He told her so that evening on the porch. "You are very good at saying things," she said. "I've been practicing," he said, "all those years talking to Dutch." She leaned against him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and the valley lay out in front of them in the spring evening, the grass green from the winter rains and the creek whispering at the eastern edge, and the 4 new apple trees very small and very definite against the fence line. Their son was born in October of that year, the year of 1875, delivered by a no-nonsense midwife named Mrs. Garza, who arrived from Stockton on a mule in the early morning and left 12 hours later with the calm efficiency of a woman who had done this work 500 times and would do it 500 more. They named him Thomas, for Olive's father. Thomas Dugan Thatcher came into the world with Oliver's dark eyes and, immediately apparent even in infancy, Olive's quality of absolute focused attention when something interested him. He was a solid, determined baby who expressed his opinions clearly and was not inclined to back down from them, a quality that both his parents found simultaneously exhausting and deeply familiar. Oliver sent his mother a letter the day after Thomas arrived, and Clara Thatcher received it and read it sitting at her own kitchen table, and felt something that she later told Josephine was simply the right order of things, which was as emotional as Clara Thatcher generally permitted herself to be on paper. The operation grew gradually, the way things grow when built by careful hands and practical minds, not fast, not dramatic, but solid. Oliver added to the herd each year as the finances allowed, always buying carefully, never overextending. He had a reputation in the valley's cattle community for straight dealing and quiet reliability, which were the qualities that mattered most in a business built on handshakes and seasonal trust. He was also known for something rarer. He paid his hired hands honestly and on time, and treated them with straightforward respect regardless of where they had come from or what languages they spoke. And in the complicated human landscape of the San Joaquin Valley in the 1870s, this was noted. Olive kept the accounts, which she was precise and exacting about, and managed the household operation with the same quality of organized intelligence that had found Agnes Macpherson's problem in the third column on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. She also became, gradually and without any particular plan, someone the neighboring women came to with questions about gardening, about nursing illness, about the practical management of difficult situations. She never presented herself as having answers, only as someone willing to think through the problem alongside you, but the effect was the same. She also, in 1877, started a lending library. It was a modest beginning, a shelf in the front room of the cabin with her own books and a dozen volumes she purchased from a second-hand bookseller in Stockton, and an open invitation to any neighbor who wanted to borrow. Within 6 months, the shelf had expanded to 2, and she had received donated books from the Caldwells and from a schoolteacher in the next township named Mr. Hirano, who said he had more than his students could read and that he was glad they would go to use. "You're building a library," Oliver said one evening, looking at the shelf that had now committed fully to the front room. "A small one," she said, "in our house." "It fits," she said. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said we could build out the north side of the cabin, a proper room. She turned to look at him. "Reading room," he said, "real shelving. Maybe a second door so people can come directly without going through the house." She looked at him for a long enough moment that he started to wonder if he had said something wrong. "Oliver Thatcher," she said, "I love you." She had said it before, many times in the natural way of a year and more of marriage, but this time it arrived with a particular directness, as though she were making absolutely certain he heard it fully. "I know," he said, which he had learned was a complete answer when said the right way, with the right amount of attention behind it. "I love you too." They built the reading room the following spring. Oliver did the framing and most of the carpentry, and the Caldwell sons helped with the heavier work. And Nora Caldwell brought 3 boxes of books from her own collection that she had been keeping in the barn, because there was no good place in their house for them. The room had its own door facing the lane, proper shelving along 3 walls, and 2 chairs by the window that got the best morning light. Olive sat in one of those chairs the evening it was finished, before any books were moved in, just sitting in the empty room with the smell of new wood, and Oliver sat in the other chair and they were quiet for a while. "Papa would have loved this," she said. "Tell me more about him," Oliver said. She had told him parts of Thomas Dugan's story at various points, but he was asking now for the whole of it, and she knew it and felt him knowing it. So she told him about her father in proper detail. The optimism, the schemes, the genuine love of learning that had been behind every failed plan, the way he had read to her as a child, the particular books they had shared, the morning he had told her they were going to Nevada to find their fortune, and how his eyes had been lit with such complete and honest hope that she had not been able to tell him all the reasons she was afraid. Oliver listened to all of it. He was very good at listening in the way that rare people are, not waiting for his turn but actually inside what she was saying, following it. "He would have liked you," she said when she finished. "He was always looking for people who did the right thing. He raised someone remarkable," Oliver said. "He did his best with what he had," she said. "That's all any of us do." Their daughter arrived in 1878, in the new room actually, which had not been the plan but turned out to be where Olive found herself when things moved faster than expected, and Mrs. Garza's mule was slower than the occasion required. Oliver delivered his daughter himself, with the midwife arriving approximately 40 minutes after the fact with professional composure, and a very dry comment about first-time fathers managing the thing better than most. They named her Clara, for Oliver's mother, who received this news and wrote back a letter of 2 full pages that was the longest letter she had written since her husband's death, and that contained within it, in her very precise handwriting, more warmth than most people produced in a year. Young Clara Thatcher was different from her brother in every way. Where Thomas was focused and still, Clara was constant motion, investigating everything, trying to take apart whatever came within reach to understand how it worked. She had Oliver's coloring and Olive's quality of finding things funny, which was a combination that produced a child who laughed a great deal and broke things in interesting ways. The Thatcher property entered the 1880s as a functioning, viable operation that had grown from 80 acres to 120, with the purchase of the adjacent parcel when the previous owner relocated north. They had 28 head of cattle, a good string of horses, a full kitchen garden, 4 producing apple trees along the creek fence, exactly as planned, and a lending library with 240 volumes that served families within a day's ride, and was the source of considerable civic pride in a community that had not expected to have one. Oliver hired 2 full-time hands, a quiet man named Esteban Ruiz, who was the most capable horseman Oliver had ever worked alongside, and a young man named Daniel Holt, who had come west on his own at 18, and reminded Oliver of himself at that age in ways that made him protective of the boy without quite meaning to be. Oliver paid them both fairly, gave them Sunday off without exception, and made clear that the opinions of men who worked the land alongside you deserved the same hearing as any other. Silas Croy, for what it is worth to the record, had left Rattlesnake Flats by 1875, the mining camp having played out its silver vein and begun the inevitable decline into abandoned structures and memory. Word reached Oliver through the cattle network of such things that Croy had relocated to Arizona Territory and continued in what were described charitably as speculative enterprises. Oliver noted this information and did nothing with it, which was the right decision. The mining camp itself dispersed, as such camps did, Percy the auctioneer disappeared into the general anonymity of men who moved with opportunity. Corbett, the freighter, continued running his Carson City route for another 6 years before retiring to live near his daughter's family. A piece of information Olive found out from a letter Hazel Drummond sent her, because she and Hazel corresponded regularly for the rest of Hazel's life. Hazel Drummond lived to be 81 years old, sharp and direct to the end, and Olive traveled to Sacramento twice to see her in her later years, and wept privately and thoroughly when the letter came informing her of Hazel's passing. Oliver's mother Clara made the journey to the San Joaquin Valley for the first time in 1879, and every 2 years thereafter, until she could no longer travel, staying each time for a month and occupying herself with a grandmother's full and exacting attention to Thomas and young Clara, who adored her in the comprehensive way children adore people who tell them true things without softening them first. Clara Thatcher thought the lending library was one of the finest things she had encountered, and said so plainly. One evening in the summer of 1881, Oliver and Olive sat on the porch in their usual positions, Olive with a letter she was writing, Oliver with the week's account spread across his knee, and the valley lay long and gold in the late sun, and the creek could be heard from the eastern edge. And in the reading room, which was clearly lit through its window, Thomas was reading something with the focused intensity he brought to everything. And young Clara could be heard somewhere in the back garden, engaged in some project that involved intermittent conversation with the dog they had acquired 2 years ago, a spotted hound named properly who had shown up unannounced one morning and declined to leave. Oliver looked up from the accounts and looked at Olive writing her letter and at the valley and at all of it and felt the word for it very clearly, though he had never been a man who reached easily for such words. "Olive," he said. She looked up from her letter. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not anxiously, not seeking reassurance, but the way he asked most things, direct, genuinely wanting to know the answer. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the wagon and the rope and the auction and the gold dust and the 3 days through the Sierra Nevada and the kitchen in the rain and the garden with the bean seedlings and the apple trees and Thomas and Clara, and all the years that had built this porch and this evening and this precise configuration of things. "Yes," she said, "I am happy. Are you?" "Profoundly," he said. She smiled at him and went back to her letter, and he went back to the accounts, and properly barked once in the back garden, and was apparently satisfied with whatever answer the situation provided. In 1883, young Thomas, who was 8 years old and entirely his mother's son in the matter of books, made his way through the entire lending library's poetry section and came to Olive with the Emily Dickinson and Whitman volume. The original, the one her mother had given her, worn soft with handling, and asked her about a poem he couldn't quite understand. Olive took the book and looked at the poem he pointed to, one she knew by heart, and then she said, "Let me tell you something about this poem. It was written by a woman who understood what it meant to feel very much and not always have a way to say it. Does that help?" Thomas considered this with the gravity of 8. "A little," he said, "but I still don't understand the last line." "Neither do I," Olive said. "That's one of the best things about it." Thomas thought about this. "Can we read another one?" She read to him for an hour, sitting in the 2 chairs in the reading room, the same chairs she and Oliver had sat in the evening the room was built, and Clara came in halfway through and climbed into Olive's lap, and went asleep there in the way of 6-year-olds who decide that wherever you are is the right place to be, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across the pages of the book. Oliver, passing the open door with a bridle over his shoulder on his way to the barn, stopped. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his wife with their sleeping daughter in her lap and their son listening to poetry in the afternoon light, and he stood there long enough to take it fully in, to put it in the category of things he intended never to forget. Then he went to the barn, because the horses needed attention and practical men attended to what needed attending, and he was both things, practical and someone for whom this moment had just become part of the permanent record. The San Joaquin summer of 1884 was particularly good, the weather holding warm and clear through September, and the cattle operation posting its best year in numbers to that point. Oliver and Esteban drove a portion of the herd to Stockton for sale in late September, and Oliver came back with a satisfying receipt, and a new saddle he had been considering for 2 years, and a box of books from the second-hand bookseller that he had picked specifically. One by one, reading the backs and the first pages in the store with the focused attention of a man who has learned to shop for someone else's library. He gave Olive the box of books. She went through them with the expression she had for things that made her truly happy, not the laugh, not the external brightness, but a contained private delight, a warmth that lived behind her eyes. "You picked these yourself," she said. "I read the first pages," he said, "some of them." She held up a novel she didn't have. "How did you know about this one?" "The woman in the store recommended it. She said it was for people who read carefully." Olive looked at him. "I told her I was buying for my wife," he said, "who reads everything carefully." She set the book down, stood up, and kissed him with the full and direct intention of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and means every part of it. And Oliver Thatcher, who had lived a decade beside this person and been loved by her through all of it, kissed her back with precisely the same intention. "Oliver Thatcher," she said after. "Olive Thatcher," he said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me," she said, "including all the difficult parts of how it happened." "Likewise," he said. "Even the shoe." "Even the shoe," she agreed. On a clear October afternoon in 1884, exactly 11 years after the spring of Rattlesnake Flats, Olive Thatcher stood at the eastern fence line of their property where it ran along the creek, looking at the 4 apple trees she had planted. They were full-size trees now, properly producing, and the creek ran clear and cold beside them in the fall light, spring-fed, exactly as Oliver had said. She had a basket of apples she had just picked, the first full harvest she had taken from these trees, and the weight of it was satisfying in the specific way of things that have taken a long time to arrive. She stood there for a few minutes with the basket and the sound of the creek and the October light coming warm through the apple branches, and she thought about all of it, not in a sad way, not in a looking-back way, but in the way you take inventory of something that belongs to you, something real and built and lasting. Oliver came through the south gate with Dutch, who was considerably older now and considerably more opinionated about being ridden long distances, though he continued to go along with it out of what Oliver chose to interpret as loyalty, and tied the horse at the gate and walked across the field to where she was standing. He took an apple from the basket without asking, which was his permanent right, and bit into it. "Good?" she asked. "Very," he said. They stood at the creek fence together in the October afternoon, and the valley stretched out around them in all directions, and the apple trees were exactly where she had put them. Thomas came running from the direction of the cabin, his dark head catching the sun, calling something about young Clara having gotten properly stuck under the porch again and requiring adult assistance with the extraction. Oliver handed Olive the apple back, kissed her briefly but with full attention on the cheek, and went to deal with the situation. Olive watched him go, watched her son running ahead of him, heard in the near distance her daughter's voice directing the dog extraction operation with the confidence of a 7-year-old who has a very specific plan. She turned back to the creek for one more moment. The water ran clear over its stones, cold and constant, spring-fed from somewhere up in the mountains she couldn't see from here, finding its way down through the land to the eastern edge of everything she had built. She picked up her basket of apples and walked back toward the cabin, toward all of them, toward the life they had made out of a bag of gold dust, and a hand extended across a wagon bed, and 3 days through the Sierra Nevada, and bean seedlings in a Sacramento garden, and all the years of ordinary good days that followed. The screen door of the cabin was open in the fall warmth, and through it she could hear Oliver's voice and Thomas's and Clara's and Properly's bark, and the sound of it was the sound of her particular abundance, and she walked through the door into it. The apple trees stood at the fence line in the October light, 4 of them in a row, exactly where she had planned. They produced every year after that.